Bom dia. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, many of you are both. I want to really thank first Magalhães, Antonio Rocha Magalhães, for the opportunity to address this group and to put together this conference, which has been extremely rich for me. But I just want to start my presentation with a few words in Portuguese. So for all of you two Bobs and other non-Portuguese speakers, headphones might be good. This is just for a few moments. Somos muitos severinos, iguais em todo e na sina. Há de abrandar estas pedras suendo-se muito em cima. Há de tentar despertar terra sempre mais extinta. Há de querer arrançar algum ressaldo da cinza. Mas para que me conheçam melhor, vossas senhoras, e melhor possam seguir a história de minha vida, passo a ser o Severino, que em vossa presença emigrar. This is from a poem entitled Morte e Vida Severina. By João Cabral de Melo Neto. And it speaks of the difficulties, the pain of living in a land of drought, northeast Brazil, a land that's had much suffering. And the last line of the poem says, "To know me better, follow me as I migrate." And I think this speaks strongly to what does it mean to have knowledge of the problems we are studying. This is from the humanities, but it's about experience. It's about the experience that we, as researchers, try deeply to have. It's the firsthand knowledge of what it means for someone to live a marginal or severino, a severe marginalized life. And so I just wanted to bring that up because 18 years ago here in Fortaleza, I found this poem at the first ECG. And it struck me as representing much of what we are trying to talk about. 18 years ago, the situation we were looking at was very different. Not only was climate change a speculation, not as widely accepted as today, despite that there are naysayers, climate change was also the domain squarely of the natural sciences. And there were some social scientists involved, mostly people involved with drought relief and issues around that. But the social sciences were at the edge. And one of the things that I want to say today that really strikes me is that in this meeting, the social sciences not only were deeply involved front and center, but the natural scientists as well as social scientists are calling for working together. Not all. There's always people that don't see the necessary connections or probable connections, but I think we are really starting to work together. And I think we as scientists, natural scientists, social scientists, I'm trained as a physicist to begin with, so I speak a little physics. It's a whole other language, but nonetheless, we should truly try to experience that marginality of Severino, and I think all of us would then be able to speak more clearly with each other. Let me just go on to my presentation, which I just had a total failure of PowerPoint transfer, so this is the last version. I'll have to just improvise a few moments there. Okay. Obrigado. This is for pointing. Okay. I've put up a diagram here, which is not the right one because that's this one. 19 years ago, the debate was about climate impacts. ICID, one of those I's in there was impactos, impacts of climate. But what we saw was that the same climate event, a drought of the same meteorological magnitude in northeast Brazil, which killed millions of people, would kill nobody in the northwest or southwest United States. What we see in other parts of the world is that a storm, a typhoon in Bangladesh will kill 300,000 people 30 years ago, and a larger storm hitting the same coastline just a few years ago killed, I think it was 1,300 or something on the order of 150 times less people. Clearly, these are not the outcomes, that is, the death and the suffering, are not coming out of the sky. Vulnerability does not come from the sky. Vulnerability is on the ground. And this is what we need to understand, because part of the composition of vulnerability, part of what triggers the negative events that we see and associate with climate are climate events. We have to better understand that link between those climate events and outcomes. To do that, we can invert the equation, and instead of looking at the multiple effects of a single event, which in fact can be done in a static way, we look at the multiple causes of just one of those outcomes. So we pick one outcome, and what we begin to see is that vulnerability is composed of many of the elements that we think of as the social, political, economic context in which we live. Poverty and its causal structures of exploitation, resource access problems, political exclusion, market fluctuations, unstable policies, all these things we know very well. These are the things that push people to the margins so that when climate events occur, climate events and trends, and trigger outcomes that we are we're horrified by, we see that now climate is one amongst many causal variables in that equation. I think we heard from this panel today exactly that statement as well, coming from both sides, science, natural science, social science. We really still have a long way to go in understanding how to keep a dialogue going in which the social, structural, not just the proximate causes, but the distant causes that happen in boardrooms of corporations, the causes that come from government policy or international policy or trade agreements. We need to begin to keep those in the room when climatological discussions are going on and modeling efforts are going on to understand why disasters occur. So what I think we see here is that many of those variables are the variables of development. And by the way, I added at the bottom adaptation and mitigation. These can be causes of vulnerability. They can also be causes of security. All of these variables, in some way or another, contribute to both, and we need to keep them in the equation. So in this sort of a diagram, climate is one amongst many variables. And I want to say that I think this was a difficult pill for many climate scientists looking at climate change to swallow. The idea is that it might marginalize climate as a problem, being only one amongst many, but in fact what it shows is that it is one amongst many, and that we need to address it, because I think we social scientists understand the extraordinary interdependence and integrated nature of the problems we face. They are not, the variables are not independent from each other. The new term on the block is adaptation. It's taken place of what used to be called coping and resilience. I think we need to remember there are long histories of research on coping and even maladaptive, as people say now, coping. Situations where people would cope, exhaust their assets, and be worse off at the next event were studied in the Sahel in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. We're aware of these things. But today, because we've changed the term, we've lost some of that history. But I saw an enormous amount of extraordinary research, new research, in this conference looking at the intertemporal effects of policy on reducing and increasing vulnerabilities. And I think that's an important thing. We're not just concerned with the consequences associated with climate, but also with the consequences associated with climate response. In any case, I think that associating adaptation with development as a desired outcome, not necessarily development as the institutions that we have known, because I think we need to, as Renata mentioned, bring into question many of the old paradigms of development. But development as an objective associated with adaptation questions could bring some more positive attention to the plights in the lands we work in. But I will say that 20 years ago, 18 years ago, when we looked at this, we had to ask the question, why is it that we have to talk about potential disasters in the future, vulnerabilities, hunger, famine, dislocation, when in fact they're occurring now and nobody is addressing them, or they're being addressed in post hoc disaster relief situations and not in ways that might address the causal structures of these very problems. Today we're at the same place. IPCC Fifth Assessment Report is currently ongoing. While we sit in this room, there are thousands of people around the world working on this new report. The structure of that report has brought adaptation front and center. It has marginalized vulnerability in the history of analysis. Look at these carefully. I don't expect anyone to read them. The outline of the report is here. Look at it very carefully. When you look at it, you will see there is no place in this report to look at the causal structure, because if you look at the causal structure, you begin to map it onto institutions at different scales of society that have responsibility. Responsibility is associated with blame. Nobody wants that. The politics dictate that vulnerability be relegated to something we have to look at as an indicator. Okay? It's an indicator. We want to know where those vulnerable people are. So a vulnerability indicator. We don't want to know why they're vulnerable. And we also want to know how they're going to adapt. That is, how they're going to go forward from where they are, not asking how they got there. Adaptation is a term that doesn't ask the question, why do we have to adapt? And what is it that puts us in that position of necessity and often of dire need? Now, I think adaptation is here to stay as a term, and I welcome it. But I think we have to look at it and understand its limits and understand its place in these debates and not accept it without question. It is a term that we need to think through as social scientists, why it emerged as a term, as part of this discourse, and what effects it might have, and what kinds of knowledge this term, this discourse, includes and excludes, because knowledges are plural, and they are also discursive. They are about how we talk about things and why within a larger collective social endeavor. So beyond the Fifth Assessment Report, before it begins, what are active ingredients of risk and vulnerability? What are the causes that we need to keep in mind as we talk about adaptation, a term I think we need to still, as I can critique that term, I know it's here, and what we need to do is infuse it with meanings that make it inseparable from the analysis of vulnerability and its causes. That's the way I'd like to see us move forward. What are the elements that must change for there to be effective adaptation? Some